Okay, so today we are diving into Radical Candor by Kim Scott,
Yeah.
which, it's funny. Everyone wants to be a better leader, right?
Right.
But nobody wants to be like that guy, the
Mm.
one who just like leaves a trail of like demoralized colleagues in their wake.
Totally.
And this book is all about how to strike that balance, right?
Yeah.
How to challenge people directly, but still show that you genuinely care about them as people.
Yeah, and I think it does a really good job of that because it's sort of
Yeah.
immediately it's like you're not just like some kind of, results-driven robot, right?
Right.
You're a human being who's trying to like lead other human beings.
It really is about the human beings, and that's why I think the book is so successful. But it also, I think, really directly attacks this myth of the nice boss.
Oh, interesting. This idea that like
Yeah, like the too nice boss who's just like afraid to ruffle any feathers. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And that's actually one of the things that she calls ruinous empathy, right?
Interesting, ruinous empathy. So you're saying that like by avoiding those difficult conversations, those bosses are actually holding their teams back.
100%. Yeah. I mean, they think that they're being kind by not bringing up these difficult subjects. But the reality is like when we don't give honest feedback, we're not giving people the opportunity to grow.
That's such a good point. And it's something that I think a lot of people struggle with, right? Because we all have blind spots, like we might not even realize how our behavior is impacting others until someone points it out to us.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to create this culture where feedback is seen as a gift and not a weapon.
Right.
And I think that that's really what radical candor is all about.
So how do we actually put this into practice, right?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to talk about it, but like how do we actually do it? Let's say you've got that classic meeting interrupter on your team, the person who's like full of ideas, which is great, but they tend to kind of steamroll everyone else in the process. How do you address that with radical candor?
So I think the thing to keep in mind with radical candor is
Yeah.
it's really all about these two core dimensions, right? It's care
Yeah.
personally and challenge directly. Right.
Right.
And so instead of, saying to this person, you're always interrupting or you're a bull in a china shop when it comes to meetings, you could say something like, hey, I've noticed you've been jumping in a lot during our meetings.
Mhm.
And I love your energy and I really, I love the ideas that you're bringing to the table, but I also want to make sure that everyone has a chance to share their thoughts.
It's interesting because it's almost like you're acknowledging their positive qualities first. You're
Yes.
saying, like, hey, I love your enthusiasm, I love your ideas. But then you're also gently pointing out the impact of their behavior.
Yeah.
It's not just like, hey, you're being a jerk, stop it.
It's not a criticism.
It's like, hey, how can we make this work for everybody? Right?
Actually,
So
yeah.
you're not just criticizing them, you're kind of guiding them towards a more productive approach.
Totally. You're flagging an obstacle
Yeah.
and you're suggesting a detour that's going to benefit the entire team.
I love that.
But, it's not always that simple, right? Like, what about the flip side of that coin? What about when you have like a team member who is consistently missing deadlines,
Hmm.
but you know that they're going through like a really tough time personally?
Yeah.
So how do you balance compassion with accountability in that scenario?
Yeah. That's tricky, right? Because you don't want to add to their stress, obviously. But you also have a responsibility to the team and to the project, right?
Right. And that's where this care personally element becomes so important. You start by really acknowledging their situation, offering support. You might say something like, hey, I know you've had a lot on your plate lately, and I want to be sensitive to that. Is there anything I can do to help? Or do we need to adjust your workload temporarily?
So you're showing them that you see them as a human, not
Yes.
just like a,
It's deadline machine.
some sort of deadline
Yes.
meeting machine, right? But then how do you transition from that to actually addressing the work itself without sounding insensitive?
Yeah. So after you've demonstrated that genuine empathy,
Hmm.
it's perfectly okay to then gently but directly address the performance issue. You could say something like, at the same time, we need to make sure that these deadlines are met. Can we work together to kind of figure out a way to manage this going forward?
So it's about finding that balance, right? It's like offering support, but also being clear about expectations.
Absolutely.
But I gotta say, I think one of the most intimidating situations is giving upward feedback. Let's say your boss, has this habit of getting bogged down in the tiniest details during meetings, and
Yeah.
it's like killing everyone's productivity.
Hmm.
How do you approach that with radical candor without, basically putting your own neck on the line?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely a delicate dance.
Yeah.
But again, I think it goes back to those two principles of caring personally and
Yeah.
challenging directly, right? So you could start by saying something like, I know how much you value accuracy and attention to detail, which I really respect. And I see how you're trying to make sure that, we're covering all of our bases.
Okay, so you're acknowledging their good intentions. You're acknowledging the value of what they're trying to do.
Exactly.
But then how do you actually deliver the feedback part without sounding like you're telling your boss what to do?
Right. So I think the key here is to focus on the impact
Hmm.
and then propose a solution,
Yeah.
right? So you could gently point out the downside by saying something like, however, sometimes when we get into the weeds like this in a meeting, it prevents us from focusing on the bigger picture and making decisions efficiently as a team. Could we maybe try reserving those more detailed discussions for a follow-up meeting or, for a smaller group?
It's not just about like raising a concern, it's about being part of the solution.
Right.
It's like, I see this potential obstacle and I want to help us navigate around it as a team.
Exactly. Yeah, you're bringing solutions, not just problems.
But, you know, let's be real, right? Like, even with the best intentions,
Right.
not everyone responds well to feedback,
Totally.
no matter how thoughtfully it's delivered. So what happens when you encounter defensiveness?
Right. And defensiveness is it's a natural human reaction,
Yeah.
especially when you feel like you're being criticized. And I think the key here is to not meet defensiveness with defensiveness.
Oh, that's so hard.
I know, it's so hard, right? But instead, try to stay calm, reiterate your positive intent, and focus on, again, that shared goal, right?
So it's like, take a deep breath.
Yes,
Don't take the bait when someone gets defensive.
exactly.
What are some phrases that you can use to kind of like diffuse the situation and bring it back to a more productive place?
Yeah, you could say something like, I understand that this is difficult to hear, and I want to make sure that I'm coming across clearly. My intention isn't to criticize you, it's to help you succeed.
It's like you're reminding them that you're on their team,
Yes.
even when the conversation is tough.
100%.
You're their advocate, even when you're delivering difficult feedback,
Exactly.
which is a really important thing to keep in mind.
It is, and I think that's what's so crucial about radical candor is it's not just about these individual conversations, right? It's about creating a culture where this type of open and honest communication thrives.
So it's not a one and done thing. It's about weaving it into the fabric of how you communicate as a team, as an organization. But how do you actually make that happen, right? How do you go from a culture of like silence to a culture of radical candor?
Yeah, it's definitely a process. It's not like a switch you can just flip overnight.
Yeah.
But Kim Scott, does offer some really practical advice on how to kind of like gradually introduce these principles into the workplace.
Okay.
And one of her key recommendations is to start small.
Okay, so instead of trying to like revolutionize your entire company culture overnight, you're saying it's better to focus on like incremental changes?
Exactly. Don't try to boil the ocean. Start with like your own team, your own interactions. Look for opportunities to like give and receive feedback more frequently, even in small ways.
What would that look like in practice?
Yeah, so like a really simple example could be like at the end of a meeting. Instead of just, closing your laptop and rushing off to your next thing, just take like 30 seconds and say, what's one thing that we could do differently next time to make this meeting even more productive?
Oh, I like that.
Or what feedback do you have for me on how I ran this meeting?
Yeah, that's great. It's like making feedback this regular part of your team's rhythm, not just like this thing that you dread once a year during performance reviews, right?
Yes.
Speaking of performance reviews, though, I think, that those can be like a minefield of awkwardness and anxiety.
Oh, totally.
So how does radical candor apply to those like high stakes conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the most powerful things you can do is shift your mindset about performance reviews.
Yeah.
Instead of viewing them as this like once a year obligation, think of them as an opportunity to really have like a meaningful conversation about growth and development.
Okay, easier said than done though, right?
Right.
I feel like a lot of people, both managers and employees, approach performance reviews with this like sense of dread.
100%. Yeah. And I think it's because they're often shrouded in secrecy and ambiguity, like nobody really knows what to expect. And so it just becomes this like big scary thing.
Yeah, and you're just like bracing for impact, right? Like what's gonna come out of left field this time?
Exactly. But radical candor encourages us to like approach these conversations with more transparency and clarity.
Okay, so it's like instead of blindsiding someone with a laundry list of criticisms once a year, You're saying it's better to give that feedback regularly in the moment.
Right, exactly. So that way, there are no surprises come performance review time.
Mm-hmm.
It's about having an ongoing dialogue, not a dreaded annual event. And, another thing that I think is really helpful is Scott introduces this really interesting framework called the Superstars and Rockstars Matrix.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Okay, so basically, it's a way to kind of like categorize employees based on their performance and their potential. So you have your superstars who are like high performing, they're always looking to grow, they're ambitious. And then you have your rock stars who are, solid performers, they're reliable, but they're content in their current roles. They're not necessarily looking to like climb the corporate ladder and they're happy where they are.
Okay.
And then of course you have people who are underperforming and then you have people who are, maybe still finding their footing.
And the idea is to like tailor your approach to each of those categories.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So for example, like with superstars, you want to be challenging them with new opportunities. You want to be helping them reach their full potential. With rock stars, it's more about recognizing their contributions, finding ways to keep them engaged and motivated, even if they're not, necessarily going to be the next CEO of the
Oh,
company.
right. Because they might not want to be, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's totally fine.
Exactly. And it's about like recognizing that not everyone wants to be a superstar or a rock star.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay.
Yeah, and you don't want to like force someone into a box that they don't fit in.
Exactly. Exactly. And then, I think another important aspect of this is the idea of get shit done feedback,
Get shit done feedback.
which is all about like acknowledging and appreciating those small everyday wins that keep a team moving forward.
Oh, I love that. Because I feel like those small wins can often get overlooked in the grand scheme of things.
Totally, totally. It's so easy to get caught up in like the big picture,
Yeah.
the major milestones that we forget to like celebrate the small victories along the way. But those small wins are what create momentum and they keep a team motivated.
So it's like a well-placed, great job on that presentation, or thanks for staying late to help us meet that deadline. Like those things actually do matter.
They matter so much, and it shows that you're paying attention. It's not just about, waiting for the big, huge accomplishments. It's about recognizing and appreciating the effort, even if it's not, always glamorous
Yeah.
or headline grabbing.
Right. It's those little things that add up over time.
Exactly. And, here's the thing about radical candor that I think is so important. It's not just about giving feedback. It's also about receiving feedback gracefully.
Oh, which can be even harder.
Oh my gosh, so much harder.
Right. It's one thing to like dish it out,
Totally.
but it's another thing entirely to take it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people really struggle with that.
Absolutely. And it takes practice, as a muscle that you have to build.
Yeah.
But one of the most important things you can do is to go into any feedback conversation with the assumption that the other person has good intentions.
Even if the feedback itself is hard to hear.
Yes, even if the feedback is like, really difficult to hear. Because most of the time, people aren't trying to be hurtful or critical. They're trying to help you improve. They're trying to help you grow.
Right.
And I think if you can come from that place of like assuming positive intent,
Yeah.
it makes it so much easier to receive the feedback.
Yeah, that's a really important reminder because it's so easy to get defensive when we feel like we're being attacked.
Totally.
But remembering that, like, okay, this person, they're coming from a place of good intentions. They want me to succeed. That can really help us stay open to what they have to say.
Yeah.
But what about those times when the feedback really does sting? Even if you know it's well-intentioned? Like, what do you do with those emotions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's okay to feel those emotions. It's human to feel hurt or defensive when we receive criticism. The key is to not let those emotions control your reaction.
Okay.
So take a beat, like pause, process what you've heard, and then decide how you want to respond.
Right. It's like, don't react, respond. Take that moment, gather your thoughts, instead of just like firing back with some defensive reply that you regret later, right?
Exactly. And sometimes that even means like saying something like, I need a minute to process this.
Mm.
Can we circle back to it later?
Right. Give yourself that space. But ultimately, what's the payoff of all of this? Like, why should we put in the effort to have these difficult conversations and risk those awkward moments and all of that?
Well, because the rewards are huge. When we create a culture of radical candor, we unlock this level of trust and collaboration and innovation it's not possible in an environment where people are afraid to speak their minds.
So it's not just about being a nice boss or avoiding conflict.
No, not at all. It's about caring enough to challenge people to grow, to like push each other to be their best selves.
And I found like even in my own work, when I feel comfortable like sharing my ideas, even if they're not fully formed, even if they're kind of half-baked, knowing that I'm not going to be judged or shut down for it, it makes me so much more creative and productive.
100%, because you're creating that psychological safety
Yeah.
where people feel comfortable taking risks, admitting mistakes, and learning from each other. And that's really, that's when the magic happens.
I love that. The magic of a high-performing team, right? Where everyone feels valued and empowered to contribute their best work. But it all starts with that willingness to be radically candid with
Yes,
ourselves and with each other.
it's a journey, not a destination. And it's not always easy, but it is so worth it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on radical candor, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Think about a recent workplace situation that left you feeling stuck or frustrated or maybe even, a little bit defeated. How could you have approached that situation differently using some of the principles that we've talked about today?
Yeah, what small step can you take this week to bring a little bit more honesty, a little bit more humanity, a little more radical candor into your interactions at work?
Remember, even small changes can have a ripple effect, so go forth and be radically candid. You might be surprised at the difference it makes.